Welcome to another KNE Speaks. This time we are talking about Peer Review Week 2022. I'm Emily Choynowshi, Head of Publishing at Knowledge E, and with me, I'm delighted to say, are Duncan Nichols, the President of the European Association of Scientific Editors, and Liz Allen, Director of Strategic Initiatives at F1000. So first of all, thank you both for joining us today. Now this week, it is, as I said, the International Peer Review Week. So what better time to ask that really big, meaty question? Why is peer review so important?
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak with you for this session. Really enjoy every week of Peer Review Week that's been held so far, and it's always great to be involved in these initiatives. I'll hand over to Liz first to kick us off for talking about the importance of peer review, and then I might add some thoughts of my own.
Great, thanks, and thanks for inviting us to talk on this topic, which is really a great time to be talking about peer review. I think one of the most important things is it just remains such a key part of the whole research process to have an expert validate or certify that something that's been discovered or described makes sense to them, and to have that kind of way to quality assure research that's being produced. And peer review is used obviously across all aspects of the research system. Publishers use it, research funders use it, research institutions also use peer review and get expert views on work that's being produced by them and by the researchers that they work with. So it just remains a really fundamental, important part of providing trust and transparency, particularly in research. So peer review remains like a really important thing.
Underlying message, very important indeed. Sorry, Duncan, over to you.
So I totally agree on the trust aspects, and that was one of the themes of well, it has been a theme of Peer Review Week in the past, and one of the most important aspects, I think, is that people look to journals as venues for research that they can trust in, and peer review it supports the validity of the research in terms of the article itself that people read. But I think increasingly peer review plays a role in educating younger researchers about how to communicate research in effective ways, how articles and research projects develop over time, and with increased transparency of peer review systems, we get to see more of that process and understand how scientific articles are created, and what we've kind of taken for granted in the past as this final immaculate article, all of the processes that go into making that. So it's becoming a very educational experience, as well as just that sort of sense of validity and trust on the research itself.
And I think it's so important as well that both of you mentioned both grants, because I think grant proposals and grant reviews, people tend to think of a peer review, it's very much, it's very narrow, it's the stuff to get in the article, but it is much broader than that. It affects every aspect of the research ecosystem so much more broadly, and it is so important to establish that trust and that understanding of what is going on. So moving on from that, what would you both say are probably the most pressing issues affecting peer review processes now, and the whole, perhaps not just the processes, but maybe the concepts surrounding peer review?
Yeah, so I'd like to sort of jump in on that, and sort of hooking on the previous question a little bit as well. I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that peer review itself is not an exact science either. It's a very educative, iterative process, and while having kind of experts reviewing work, ultimately an expert's view is an expert's subjective view. So we have to be mindful that building our understanding on what we know, there's a specific place and time for that, and things change, what we know changes, and it's really important that we sort of understand that science and research is an evolving thing. So one of the pressing issues, I think, is more awareness that actually we need to provide more support for the whole peer review system, and more understanding and education, like Duncan said, about what it can do and what it can't do, and that's why I think more transparency in the process is something that is a pressing issue for peer review. Just a couple of other key things. For me, one of the the main things that we hear about as publishers and funders also see this issue is the time burden involved in being a peer reviewer. So that's one of the key pressing issues is making sure that we don't have too much reviewer fatigue. We support reviewers in the processes that we put in place to secure the reviews. We make it easy for them. And one of the key things is to make sure that we get better at providing visibility and recognition for the work that they've put in to be a reviewer. So there's a whole raft of things that I think are things that we could do to improve how we value and support experts in the whole system, which is essentially peer review.
Yeah, that segues to some of my thoughts on, I think, pressing issues that I've noticed. There's kind of three key things. Is the effectiveness with which publishers can carry it out, as in terms of a burden of the workloads on publishers themselves and the processes. There's the researchers who are increasingly concerned, maybe not the perfect word to describe it, of the extra work that it's demanding of those. The increased volume in papers that are being submitted necessitates an increased demand on the workload of researchers to review articles. So that's increasingly an issue, I think, in people valuing their time and starting to question, like Liz said, what publishers do and the value of things that publishers do, which puts another stress on the publishers of trying to explain exactly what it is that what is so valuable about a publisher version of an article compared to someone just putting it on their blog, and removing all of the laborious peer review process. And then the third, I think, probably, well, they're all important, but the issues of ethical conduct of research and how effective the peer review process is at spotting these, preventing them, and avoiding any unreliable research from being published. Again, because like Liz said, it's not a perfect process, but at least it is an obstacle in the way of that of unethical conduct and research, whether deliberate or accidental. At least we do have that check there, as opposed to nothing at all.
And sort of coming at it from the publisher side and the sort of publishing author side, I mean, certainly I have recently gone through some truly tremendous peer review on a personal level, like the quality of reviews that I have received, the time that the editors have taken to work with me. One article went through 3 rounds of peer reviews, and each time the editor found, because I'd taken it on board, he didn't want to for the original reviewer. So each time, once they'd approved, he was like, but it's slightly different now, I'll go for other people. And my articles are better and better and better. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that. But the other side, as the publisher, I think even more than I would as a regular, author, I appreciate the amount of work that must have gone into that, because one of the key problems that a number of our journals that we publish here at Knowledge we've been having, particularly this year, has been sourcing those reviewers. We're getting so many delays because, reviewers, even people who've agreed to be reviewers, and this isn't us as a publisher, it's the editorial boards for the journals that we publish for medical societies, for universities, and their reviewers, they're not even when they respond, they're saying no far more than they used to, but also beyond that, half the time they're not responding. There's people who've been chased since May. At the very least, you'd think they'd have time to reply, and they're just not replying. And I think it comes back to what you were saying, Duncan, about that recognition that, and because it's not a university KPI, because there's no barometer of achievement associated with it, people just aren't. There's so much more being published, and there's also so much more demand upon researchers' times now than there ever was before. They're expected to be social media people, they're expected to do public outreach, they're expected to almost support the university brand as well as just publish good content and teach good classes, but they just don't have time anymore.
Yeah, there are myriad demands that are increasingly being added to of what is expected of researchers and what they can do with their research following the impacts of it. creating more impacts in different situations, like you said,
And
social
often,
media.
a lot of the time at their own personal expense, which makes it doubly unfair because you're actively out of pocket on top of out of time. So moving on then, obviously there are a lot of issues affecting peer review in general, but also a lot of huge changes that are happening within this area of the academic ecosystem. So I believe, Duncan, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that peer review week is something, you know, you're very, very much essentially involved with, and how much of the sort of the changes of the system and the pressures it's under contributed to the development of the peer review week initiative?
Well, yes, I mean, peer review week was established to kind of enhance some of the things that we've touched on already, like the value of peer review, what it actually does, address some misunderstandings about what peer review can achieve, highlight the things that it does achieve well, and for the whole global kind of publishing academic community to collaborate in slightly different ways that didn't quite exist before peer review week started. And one of those is something that you touched on, Emily, about the kind of academic assessment recognition of peer reviews. That's certainly been a theme developing for, well, probably too long now, too many years before
It'll happen eventually.
before it's still reached kind of an actual presence in academia, but still increasing that kind of the value of peer reviews for researcher contributions to their field and things is something that's one of the threads of peer review we've been highlighting as we've been incorporating more institutions and funders as well. And one of the goals of peer review week is to involve more of the funding agencies and funding bodies in the organizing committee who are running events to raise awareness of well, and incorporate the grant review into the whole concept of peer review week as well, to make it even more kind of a holistic event. And
so this year's theme is research integrity. So I'm throwing this back to both of you. How does research integrity relate to peer review, and why is it so important?
I think that's a kind of
big question.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question. It's also fundamental to what peer review is about. It's about peer review and having an expert view on things. It's about making sure that, you know, we're doing research that people have confidence in and they can trust. So ultimately, peer review is one of the cornerstones of being able to do that. So in research integrity and transparency are kind of key to that, to make sure that, you know, we're you know, we help provide accountability, we provide validity, credibility to the research that's been put out there, and that's what we do. What we're trying to do as publishers, it's really important that that's what we support in terms of the services we provide. And, you know, the downside, if we don't do that, we put research out there that, you know, is either poor quality or hasn't been checked or validated, and, you know, there is risk associated with all of that in terms of what people could use in terms of research, and, you know, that they might use research in the wrong way, or, you know, build on something that's not ready to be shared, and all those kinds of things. So it's really important that you know, peer review is an essential part of research integrity. It's all about trust and use and maximizing the potential impact of research.
And I think well, since Liz has been invited as the from F1000, which I should say is one of my, or if not my favorite publishing model for research at the moment, for those reasons of kind of transparency and enhancing the visibility of the whole reviewing process, and giving, you know, multiple avenues of people to comment on articles at different stages and enhancing transparency. I think that model of having selected reviews and open reviews and showing each of the various stages of the paper, having that all accessible, is kind of an excellent way of presenting that and enhancing that integrity of the review process. In terms of peer review itself kind of supporting and being a cornerstone of integrity, we have seen that it's not always effective in actually creating integrity in research, because the research is already conducted before it gets to the peer review stage. And that's why particularly a lot of the part of the open access model was to allow valid research, checking for the methodology of papers as the most important aspect of them. And that is really the part in a lot of the kind of consultancy and training work I do. I tend to stress to younger researchers, early career researchers, that the methodology really is the most fundamental aspect of the research paper, because it can't be changed. Once you come to write up the paper and submit it to the reviewers, it's too late to go back and change your methodology. And yeah, going back down to the institutional level of training researchers in what they can expect when they come to publish, and understanding these aspects of publication and research ethics are going to be of fundamental importance to your publishing career. So it is all very much related, and what happens in peer review can foreshadow and be used to educate people of the fundamentals of research ethics. So the Retraction Watch database is an amazing, really useful resource and tool for showing people and demonstrating that all of these papers, or filtering it for the types of misconduct or like deliberate or accidental things that go wrong with papers, or things that are spotted in peer review after, and demonstrating the amount of work that it takes to address some of these problems when it comes to publication systems.
To play devil's advocate, though, not least because I come from a humanities background and both of you are very sciencey, so Duncan, what you were talking about there around the methodology and everything else, it is very scientific focused. If I'm writing an article, it's largely subjective, it's literature and culture, so I'm going and digging out and ferreting out forgotten sort of ephemera scraps of information and pulling it together to say, oh, this is what people thought at the time. Methodologically, it doesn't really have a formal thing, but also, let's face it, I'm sad to say, but it wouldn't have any particularly vast knock-on ramifications if I'd done it wrong. So from that perspective, but also Liz, from what you were saying earlier around that sort of prevention of fake news and everything else, and the integrity of the research, how much, and I think COVID obviously gives a really good example, an overused one perhaps, but it is still relevant, is there that balance between the value of peer review, and I said I am playing devil's advocate here, that all it effectively does is delays research. If Duncan, what you're saying is that the value of the peer review is to teach them to do it better next time they conduct a study. A lot of people, we all know it takes a long time. It takes a long time to get stuff published. And one of those key hurdles is the dearth of experienced experts in the right subject fields with the time on their hands. There is that balance between, making sure that what's there is the best that it could be in and of itself, but also valuable to the wider community, whether health or academic, but also preventing it from getting to the right community because it's taking 18 months to publish instead of 3 hours to put it on a blog with a pretty picture. So where does the balance sit between that for both of you?
I think, that kind of comes into a little bit about what F1000 itself is trying to do, and we are seeing more and more publishers now sort of working with the concept of preprint servers and other kinds of mechanisms for researchers to share their work a bit earlier and quicker, and there is a lot of movement to kind of rethink the whole scholarly publishing process and some of the legacy systems that we have developed and built over time, which might have been appropriate in the past, but we are in a much different place now in terms of how researchers communicate and share their work than we were even 20-30 years ago. We're actually in a very different place. And F1000, if you'll allow me to sort of explain a little bit about F1000. Yeah, so and it's great to hear, Duncan, that you're a fan. So obviously this is a great conversation. Yeah, so we're a scholarly publisher, but we were founded in 2012, now part of the Taylor and Francis Group. But essentially, we started with a very clean slate that left us free from a lot of the history and legacy approaches to scholarly publishing. Obviously, some of the key things, like including peer review in our workflow, is absolutely key to us. But we've been able to sort of unpick and sort of rethink and reinvent how the actual piece of research, from a submission of an article to validity stamp and indexing in a database system, is done in a very different way. We've essentially opened the hood on everything involved in that process to present a very transparent process, which research integrity is key to that. I'm not sure we have everything right for the and I think the future and the demands change, and people are looking for different things. And our role, and one of our strengths, is that we've always seen ourselves as very open to feedback and listening to what works and what works best for research. But essentially, we've designed what we do to support the research that's being produced in the best way possible that we can imagine at this time. So we have a transparent model throughout. So we do a number of checks on a research article that's submitted to us to help ensure that there is validity to some of the key things before it's published. But the peer review is then done in the open, entirely transparently, through invited experts, but we do it entirely in the open post publication. So we do a number of checks when an article is submitted to us. Then we would do the peer review process in the open, and authors submit versions and respond to peer review comments as they go along. Essentially, we also require the submission and publication of any supporting data or resources or materials alongside that article, so that every part of the research process is as available as we can make it at this time, and that includes the peer review. So one of the things that I think is really important, and it's coming more and more, is research is, and it goes back to the recognizing the importance of peer review in the whole system, is in our model and the way that we are thinking about it, and an increasing number of publishers, peer review is an absolute research object in its own right. It has, in our model, it has its own DOI, it's citable, it's viewable. We have ORCID IDs for the reviewers, so they get credit and visibility for the work that they've done. So I think that's what we're also trying to do, is basically make sure that all parts of the research publishing and research validation process are considered together. It's an active dialogue, but the ultimate end product is still an article or a piece of research that gets validation. So that's kind of what we're doing at F1000. It's very much about research integrity and transparency, and it was designed essentially to make research as usable and reusable and able to be built upon as possible. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so if I could just jump in this, because one of the things I find most interesting about your platform, and it's one of the things when I talk about it with people that I think is if not revolutionary, but then certainly it's one of the things that sets you apart, is this idea of sort of post-publication peer review.
Yes.
And the fact that people, versioning, I think is the word to use, isn't it? Could you tell me a bit about that, all of us and the listeners, about the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Of the post-publication, yeah, yes. Of versioning. So essentially, the post-publication kind of publish review model is again gaining a little bit more traction, and again you see it coming through things like preprints. People are expecting to publish sooner than in the past. They're not interested in some of these delays. So one of the key things of the post-publication peer review model is to reduce the time taken for people to be able to get their work out there. It's still theirs when they publish it, even if the peer review hasn't been completed. So they put their mark on it. They've got it out there early. They're not subject to the delays involved in the whole securing peer reviewers and some of the challenges that we described earlier. They're not subject to that. So in terms of the process, it gets work out more quickly. It takes away a lot of the delay involved in the actual peer review process that will hold up the ability to share research. So during the COVID pandemic and other areas where research needs to be published quickly, it's the clear good way to work, and we saw a massive upsurge in adoption of our model during phases where people just don't want the delays of peer review holding them up per se, but we do have checks and balances in our system, as I described, to make sure that we're not, you know, putting work out there irresponsibly, and there's integrity around our process. So that's one of the key benefits. We also find, again, I mean, there's lots of benefits, but one of the other things that we are finding, we see a lot of people using the open peer review process to show and train others how to do peer review. So we have, I think Duncan mentioned a little bit about this. It's a really educative, iterative kind of way of working as well, because one of the things that is really missing in our system is that we need to train people how to be a constructive and helpful peer reviewer. We need to not overburden them, asking them to review things that they're not qualified to do. We need to ask them to focus where their expertise is. So training is really, really important in peer review, and that's something that our model, post-publication and transparent peer review, delivers, you know, immediately. So I'll stop there. There are lots of other things, but those are some of the key things.
Question perfectly.
I use some F1000 papers in my peer review training courses, workshops that I run, to show
Excellent.
people, to demonstrate. I use some other journals as well.
I was going to say, both of you have just teed up the next question. So Duncan, I might hand to you first for this one. Is, given training is so important, and I mean, it is something we run workshops here at Knowledge as well around training peer reviewers, but more generally, given we are lacking a supply of reviewers, given all the constraints, time, training, KPIs, everything else, how do we go about building up a stable, sustainable peer review pool, whether as a publisher, as a journal, or just in general for the overall academic ecosystem?
It is quite tricky, because increasingly people are conscious of demands on their time, and they are being demanded more of them. So I think that is one of the key obstacles at the moment. But in terms of the actual sort of process and educating people on what is the structure of a peer review, how to approach it, what are the kind of valuable comments that can and need to be made on a paper to actually serve the purpose of what peer review is designed for, those are the kind of skills that people pick up over time, but that can be taught. You can shortcut that a little bit with some good training of the fundamental things that editors need advice on from reviewers, not necessarily like an 8-10 page essay completely dismantling every aspect of the article. If a reviewer wants to get carried away and do that, create a review that's longer than a paper, which does happen, then they can, but actually that's not really the best use of their time. Maybe not the best, it's probably not the best use of the editor's time, having to go through it and understand what's actually useful. And then the author has to unpick the meaning from that. How should they change their paper in response to a huge number of comments? So the fundamentals of what types of comment to make, how the editor passes those comments onto the author, and how the author can respond to them. It's very useful to demonstrate the actual practical application of those changes, which open peer review models are really helpful for showing people. But that kind of training can be delivered and can be effective. I mean, I know studies over the last few years on the efficacy of peer review training have shown some kind of mixed results on how helpful it actually is. But you know, more research is needed. I think I maintain, and not just because I do peer review training, but I think that it is useful. It definitely serves the purpose of showing, structuring, helping people understand what's valuable about peer review and how it will be used by editors and authors, and making the whole process a bit more efficient and less daunting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me, just a couple of other sort of extra things. I think thinking, you know, making sure that it's built in from the start of researchers' careers, you know, getting in with working with early career researchers, making sure that they, maybe there's continuous training through a career to make sure that people are able to see the best way to comment and where to focus their efforts when they're being a reviewer as well. That would be really helpful. And another practical thing that I think would be helpful as someone who's published and someone who works at a publisher and someone who's worked at a funder, the systems that publishers use, if they can be much more easy to use and what's the word, not necessarily interoperable, but easy for people to access, easy for reviewers to actually do their review, make it really simple and not be so different every time you go to a different publisher, everything's different. Those kinds of things really don't help. The systems that people use need to be very simple and easy to use, because it takes a huge amount of time to get to know somebody's system if you've never used it before. At the moment, it's a very burdensome approach. So practical things like improving reviewing systems would be really helpful.
Excellent. And I think we have time for one more. It is a big question. We'll have to answer it quickly, I'm afraid. So each of you, I appreciate that this is a big question, but what do you both think the future of peer review looks like? Both reality and the dream.
I had a chat with a couple of my colleagues about this, and one of them's come back with a comment which I think is very on point. Is instead of asking what peer review looks like in the future, maybe the better question is making sure that we understand what is the purpose of peer review in the first place, and potentially what's the purpose of peer review now? How can we best optimize the time and the ask of experts for today, that what we need today? So maybe I'd like to see more experimentation, more testing out new approaches that work in different disciplines, and work in different areas and different career stages, but lots of kinds of things that thinking about what it is that we actually need experts to do in our research process to make what we have usable, valuable and trustworthy for everyone to build upon. But yeah, I think more experimentation, rethinking peer review is something that's really timely.
I think part of that, the answer to this as well, depends on what the future of the journal article looks like. And I think the actual journal article itself has a finite future. I think evolving kind of documents are probably where we're going, like kind of Wikipedia style pages of knowledge of the topic that are constantly added to and evolve, and you can see the iterations of them. And fine-tuning resources like that will completely change how peer review works. It won't be so I mean, it will be formalized, but it won't be this sort of modular system of the review, the editor makes a decision, the decision is sent back to the author. I don't think it can work quite like that. I know the eLife model of having a more kind of discursive whole process of submission, and the authors and reviewers and editors have a kind of chat forum of how they change the paper and fine tune it. That's really interesting, very progressive, but also not particularly scalable because it's very resource heavy, and it takes too many people and too much time to do that for all the research in the world. So but that's an idea of how some of the review system can be changed.
I think also sort of thinking a little bit about if we have a more flexible research corpus, as it were, people can go in and things change, right? Science moves on, and something that's been date stamped for 15 years ago might actually be out of date, and we need to be able to be more iterative in how we can update knowledge. And when we bring new experts into a topic that might not have been appropriate at some point in time, but now is really appropriate. So mainly thinking about how we update and how experts comment on research that over time as well, much more flexible way to put expert insight into research and make things current and valuable as they need to be.
I think also that iterative building up of knowledge on a more centralized area of where that knowledge can be found should also hopefully reduce some of the obstacles for various areas and demographics around the world, and help to make the whole process a bit more equitable, and which is a whole other kind of topic in itself.
Yeah.
That's kind of looming like the elephant in the room of who controls all the peer review and who has access to it, who is invited to comment on articles, and how not particularly kind of global that process is at the moment. It's all very heavily biased, and that's a whole different topic.
I was going to say, on that note, that very, very large forward-looking topic, I just want to say, I think we'll have to finish there, but thank you both so much for joining us. It's been a really lovely discussion. I've enjoyed myself hugely. I hope you have as well.
My
just
pleasure.
given us all a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.